people into the waiting room. Okay, I think we have just about everyone in. We have a good crowd tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jillian Zeiger from Marin County to open tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Joan. Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. We're here tonight to talk about housing and resiliency in our communities. This conversation is based on the context of updating our housing plan. However, it's really about us working together to make Marin a stronger and more sustainable place to live. Over the past year and a half, we've faced a worldwide pandemic, which has affected us all. However, our most vulnerable and lowest income residents were hardest hit, and these plans intend to make sure everyone in our communities can overcome challenges and be able to thrive through having a safe, affordable place to call home. Before we get started, we wanted to let you know that we have Spanish translation available. After I make this announcement, you'll be able to select your language.
Mr. Moreno, are you making the announcement? Okay, we're just going to give Mr. Moreno a moment to make sure the translation channel is working. Okay, we are not hearing the Spanish translation. So Ms. Moreno, if you, okay, you're hearing it? Okay, we've gotten word that that the Spanish translation is available in the Spanish channel. And again, if you need assistance, just go to the interpretation button and choose your language, and we'll be able to proceed. So, Jillian?
Okay, I would now like to introduce the team who's going to help the county plan to meet these challenges, although we've already heard from John.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. My name is Joan Chaplick. I'm a principal with MIG. MIG is the name of the consulting firm that is helping the county to prepare the housing element. I'll be assisted here tonight by my colleague, Jose Rodriguez, who is a senior policy and land use planner, and he'll be doing the bulk of the presentation. So tonight, this is one of our community road shows where MIG and county staff are going to different locations throughout Marin County to share information about the housing element and hear your input. So for our agenda, we're going to give you an update on the planning process for the housing element. We're going to talk about the process for selecting potential housing sites. We're going to give you information about how to provide input on the sites using Balancing Act, which is a digital tool. We're going to let you know about some Balancing Act office hours, and then we'll have closing comments. So we're here till 7 o'clock tonight. So the purpose of these road shows, again, is to share information with the community. We also want to provide an opportunity for participants to share their input and ask questions. And then again, we're going to give you a preview of the Balancing Act tool. In our meetings, we've been to the design review boards, and this is a meeting that's hosted by the county. We are not seeking a formal decision or response. We're just here to receive comments and questions. So we have a great turnout tonight. We have over 50 people on the Zoom. So when it comes time for questions, you can use the chat. We have a designated stopping point. Use the raise hands feature of Zoom and we will call on you. We ask people to be concise and respectful of the different opinions that we expect to hear in tonight's meeting. So with that, just a quick review. The focus is on the housing element. So this is a plan that is required every 8 years. It's the California Housing and Community Development Department, HCD, that provides all the requirements and rules that we have to follow. The housing element needs to be adopted by January 2023. So that is the pace that we're on to complete this work. And the focus for the housing element in this conversation covers the unincorporated areas. And we say that because the other cities within Marin County are doing their own housing elements. Key to the housing element conversation is the term RHNA. That is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And coming from the state, you have HCD. They determine what the housing needs are statewide, and they give an allocation, a RHNA, for each council of government. In the Bay Area, they've identified that number as 441,176 housing units, and there's an allocation for each city and county. So for all of Marin County, the RHNA totals 14,210 units. And then specific to unincorporated Marin County, the RHNA totals 3,569 units. The Marin County number is 3.2% of the total Bay Area RHNA. And of the Marin County number, the unincorporated allocation represents 25% of the overall Marin County RHNA number. Okay, and let's see. So within that RHNA number, HCD specifies an allocation of number of units that focus on meeting the needs of very low income residents, moderate income residents, and then above moderate, that's the category for market rate housing. And the chart here shows the allocation based on units. We're showing you the previous cycles because previously Marin's allocation was much lower. And in this current cycle, the housing numbers are significantly higher for all communities across the Bay Area, not just Marin County. And if we look back on what happened during the last housing cycle, there were 237 units of housing built in unincorporated county. So just a little more than maybe 30 a year over the past 8 years. So now we're going to talk about the housing site selection process, and my colleague Jose Rodriguez is going to continue the presentation.
Well, great. Thanks, Joan. My presentation is really going to focus on the housing sites and the housing sites that we've identified throughout the county and how it relates to what Joan just talked about and meeting that 3,569 units. And so I'm going to talk about the first part of the presentation is really talks about how we calculate the units, what sites we've calculated. And then at the end, I'm going to show you some tools that the county has so that you can comment on the sites. And right now they're potential sites. And I'll talk about that in a moment on all the various sites. So first thing to consider is how the state reviews the sites that we're going to select. There's a suitability criteria that the state uses. They want to make sure we recognize what are the existing uses on the sites we've identified, how many potential units that site can potentially be built in the future. And then we take into the different suitability factors, site size, what is the existing density on the site, and how many units, again, can be provided. Joan, next slide. One thing I want to bring up is in terms of the sites inventory and the number of units, Joan had talked about the numbers being divided by different income categories, above moderate, moderate, and lower income. When we identify sites, we do have to recognize what the number of units can be provided based off the density. And we do recognize that density has a correlation to affordability. So for example, we do know that larger lots that are single family homes tend to be more affordable to higher income households. And so as the lot gets a little bit smaller, so maybe a small single family lot becomes a little bit more affordable. Duplexes fall in the range of maybe a moderate income household, as well as maybe a small little accessory dwelling unit, the unit that you can build or provide in a backyard or above garage. And then multifamily, that becomes the most affordable to the lower income households. And that there's various reasons, you know, it's more efficient use of the land. Obviously, units are smaller. And so again, that becomes more affordable for the lower income households. Next slide. Before I get started on talking about the sites and how we calculate units, I do want to mention that the Board of Supervisors, to help identify our full list of sites, they have provided guidance using guiding principles. They selected these guiding principles at a December supervisor meeting where they've kind of affirmed these guiding principles. And these guiding principles are identified here. The first one is ensuring countywide distribution. When we select sites, do we want to make sure that sites are distributed throughout the county, in the rural areas, the city center areas, the baylands? The second guiding principle is addressing or recognizing racial equity and historic patterns of segregation. We do know that certain communities do have existing federal affordable housing, and there's a higher number of levels within certain communities that have lower incomes, but also higher numbers of minority populations. So that guiding principle recognizes those areas, and do we want to distribute housing based off that? Another guiding principle is whether to encourage more infill housing or redevelopment opportunities in areas that's built up, the city center or along major roadways or the Highway 101. Should housing be concentrated there where there's more services, schools, and employment? Another guiding principle is considering the environmental hazards, and these could be flooding, wildfire, sea level rise. All those are considered in that guiding principle. And the next one is leveraging surplus lands. That could be identifying lands that are owned by the state, owned by the county, and are those areas, could those areas be suitable, or properties be suitable for housing? And then the last one that the county thought was important, or the Board of Supervisors, was making sure that there's public engagement, significant public engagement. So that's why we're having these meetings and road shows, and we're having all these different tools that I'll present later on how you can comment on the draft housing list. Next slide. Let me briefly go over the strategies on how we selected the different types of housing sites. The first one is kind of the easier site to identify, is the vacant land. What land is vacant and is zone residential currently? Those are sites that we can identify for housing against that RENA number, that 3,569 number. We do have to recognize that a lot of the vacant land remaining does have constraints, steep slopes, biological resources. So we have to take those into consideration. We can also count what we call credit sites, sites that have been previously approved by the county, or they proposed a proposed project, or a project that they have approval but haven't started construction. We can count those sites. I mentioned earlier accessory dwelling units. Again, those are the smaller units allowed in all jurisdictions in California on single family properties. So you can build a small unit in the backyard or above the garage, and we can count those units against the RENA number. I mentioned earlier publicly owned land. That could be county land, state-owned land, anything that's available that could be utilized, or they're surplus lands. Those could be potentially sites to identify housing on. Increasing densities in existing residential areas. We call this upzoning. Either we increase the density or identify areas where there's potential for additional units, maybe duplexes or triplexes. Rezoning of commercial sites. If there's an existing older shopping center or a shopping center that has a large parking lot, could that allow for mixed use, maybe building residential units in the parking lot or on the upper floors, rebuilding a commercial center for mixed use. That's a strategy. Another one is religious institutions. And we're using existing recent state law that allows churches and other religious institutions flexibility in providing housing on parking lots primarily. So if a church has a large parking lot, state law now allows them to build on half of the parking lot, and they don't have to replace the parking that they removed. So it gives churches the flexibility to provide housing on their properties. So again, that gives them flexibility. And again, we're not trying to push out churches, but give them more flexibility. School sites, and these are primarily school sites that maybe have closed or no longer using it as a school or reusing the site. Are there opportunities for housing there? And then the last one is affordable housing conversion. If there's an existing building like a motel or maybe a historic structure that's vacant in the upper floors, could those be converted to housing using existing buildings for housing to convert to housing? Joan, next slide.
Okay. Oops. There we go.
Our analysis has looked at many properties throughout the entire county. We've taken into account the many hazards, infrastructure, biological resources, and looked at and actually taken out many sites that the county and through our analysis felt like those are not appropriate places for housing. And then we found other places where, you know what, this makes sense. There's the right infrastructure, or there's services available, or there's a lacking of some hazards. So we've done, again, a preliminary analysis to kind of help identify where we've identified sites. And I'm going to show you later in the presentation where those sites are. And there's some mapping tools to help, again, look at those sites and the different resources, but also the constraints on those sites. Realistic capacity assumptions. So part of not only just selecting sites, but we also want to count the number of housing units we can count on a particular site. The state or HCD is really stringent in terms of the criteria that we use in counting the number of units per sites. So for example, the example I gave earlier about a vacant site having constraints, steep slope, we have to take those into account. You know, if the site's vacant, does it meet the minimum zoning size? And then we adjust the percent of how much of that property is developable. So if, let's say, half of a property has steep slopes, we're not going to count units for the entire site. We may give it a 25 or 50% reduction because of steep slopes or other constraints on a property. So when we do show you some of the housing sites, you will see that there's a proposed or a housing unit, a number of housing unit counted for each site. The same thing goes for underutilized land, which is basically properties, which are basically sites that have buildings on them. You can have an existing housing on a site, and maybe it's just one single family home, and the density allows for additional units. We can count those sites and count the additional units on particular sites. But there's criteria that we need to recognize. We didn't just select any sites. We make sure we selected some of the larger sites. We want to make sure they at least have one existing unit. And we also use a factor that's called building to land value ratio. Basically, what we did is we looked at the assessor data, particularly the assessed land value versus what's called improvement value, which basically is the cost or the assessed value of a building. If a ratio gets really high, when we compare the building value to the land value, it shows that the property owner recently put in a lot of investments or improved the property. If the ratio is really low, it shows that investments haven't been done in a very long time, 20, 30 plus years, and we can select that site, and it would be more ideal or more prime or ripe for redevelopment. And HCD does look at that criteria. The same thing applies for commercial sites, underutilized non-residential sites. Again, we chose larger sites. We want to make sure we have criteria that recognizes how much residential is allowed versus commercial. And then, as I talked about, the religious institutions, only counting half of a parking lot area. We didn't count any of the building areas, and we didn't count the full parking lot. We only counted half of the parking areas to count units on church sites. Next slide, please. So our analysis has identified many, many sites throughout the county. In fact, we have more housing units than we actually need to meet the RHNA. And we did this on purpose. One is we want to use these meetings to have the community and the tools that we're going to show you to help whittle down the number of units that we need. We want to hear from the community what sites make sense to use in the housing element, what sites should be counted for against the RHNA. So again, we've had way too many sites, way too many housing units. So we want to use the community engagement process to whittle that number down. And I do want to make a couple of points. The first point is the county is not responsible for building any of the units. Joan mentioned the RHNA for Marin County being 3,569. The county is not responsible for building any of those. It's going to be the responsibility of the property owners. The county is responsible to make sure that the zoning and land uses are in place so that those number of units can be met if a developer or a property owner or a church decides to build those houses in the future. So I wanted to bring that point up, and I thought that's an important point. Next slide, Joan. So how are we going to whittle down those number of units? I think right now we have a little over 6,000 units, and we need to whittle it down to about 3,569. That number is ingrained in my head. To help us, we're going to go back into using the guiding principles. So the first set of guiding principles, we turn them into scenarios. So the first scenario, as I mentioned, is ensuring countywide distribution. We have a scenario based off all the units that distributes the number of housing units equally throughout the entire county. The second scenario is we have another scenario that takes away some of the housing from areas that have already higher density housing within areas that have high minority populations or areas that have experienced historic patterns of segregation. We have a scenario that addresses that. We also have a scenario that takes away a lot of the sites in the rural areas and concentrates them in the city center areas that are in the county, not necessarily within the incorporated, but the unincorporated developed areas and out of the rural areas. So it takes that into account. And then we do have one scenario that slashes or reduces a lot of the sites that are within flood areas, that are within sea level rise areas. Those are taken out on that scenario. But all the scenarios do take into account the surplus lands, and they do, and again, we want to make sure that we're using public engagement to provide comments on these. So what we want from the community is to comment on these 4 scenarios so that when the Board of Supervisors takes a look at these 4 scenarios and maybe not necessarily chooses one, but maybe takes pieces of certain scenarios based off community feedback, based on some of the sites, we want to again whittle down that number so that we can put into the housing element. Joe, next slide. So how are we going to do that? We're going to use actually a couple of tools. One of them is called Balancing Act. This is a website that you can go in and comment on particular sites, and you can go into different scenarios and adjust the number of housing units. And I'm going to do a demo on that. So let me share my screen, and we're going to do a quick demo on Balancing Act. And we have actually another tool that's called an atlas that'll allow us to comment on all the sites. So how do we get to Balancing Act? Well, first, many of you have gone to this webpage on the county's website, and you can see our meeting link is here. So to get into this meeting, this is the link. But if you scroll down, you'll see 4 icons. This is how you get it. One of these is how you get into Balancing Act. So if you go to the icon that has the scale with the 2 housing on it, 2 houses on the scales, you can click on that link and it will take you to this kind of setup page. It provides the description on Balancing Act, and I apologize, I went to the Spanish. It isn't available in Spanish and English. And oh yeah, no, I'm sorry, it is the English version. It does have some Spanish words translated. Excuse me. So if you scroll down, you can see here are the 4 scenarios, and then you can select on one of the scenarios that you chose that you feel is important to you. So the first scenario I selected was the county-wide distribution. So if you go onto the website, you can see there's a quick landing page. It talks about the 4 different scenarios, gives you a little bit of background on how the website works and what you need to do. So you can continue. There are some questions about a little bit of demographic information that you can provide. So once you get into the Balancing Act, you'll see there's a map and you can zoom in. I will zoom in on a particular, why don't I zoom into the Santa Venetia, Los Ranchitos area. And you can see there's a couple of sites that are on the Balancing Act. So you can select on a site. And this site here adjusts or has an existing, or not existing, but a unit count that we've put in for 100 units. But if you want, you can comment on that. You can add a comment saying, yeah, I think that's too many units, or I think that's probably the right amount, or it could probably hold more units. You can make that adjustment. You can make an adjustment. You can say, yeah, that could hold more units, or you can hit the red negative bar here, and you can reduce the number of units. But if you reduce the units, right here, obviously I reduced more than at 100, so that stops you there. So if we reduce units here, you do have to make up units elsewhere. So where else can you provide additional units? So if you start looking at other sites, you can add additional units. And then again, so you can make all the adjustments you want. You can, again, add comments. You can share your information on your social media account on Facebook or Twitter, or send somebody an email. We want to get the word out and let people comment on the site. And again, you can scroll around the entire county and provide comments on sites. You can go here to the left and provide comment on this particular scenario. Keep in mind, there are different 4 scenarios, and each 4 scenario, again, the numbers are adjusted based off the scenario. So if you go to the infill site, more units will be counted in the infill areas. And again, you can make your adjustments. Once you've made your adjustments, you want to try to hit a housing plan and turn this bar green. If it's red, we're going to be short on units. But once you're completed, you can hit submit, and the county will receive the comments. And we're hoping to get a lot of comments, and particularly on the sites we've identified here. I do want to mention that not all the sites are in Balancing Act. The website does have a limitation on how many sites we can add. However, we do have another tool. Let me go here real quickly, go back to those 4 icons. There is what we're calling an atlas, an interactive atlas. So if we click on that, that gets us to another website that actually has all of the sites in the county. Not only does it have the sites, it also has various information about the county. So if we zoom in, let me talk a little bit about the information and the sites. So you can see here are the sites. If you want to zoom in a little closely, you can see the sites. If you click on the sites, it tells you the site code, the address, the number of acres. And keep in mind, this is the potential housing units. I want to mention that we've identified sites, but potentially all these sites may not go to the housing element. We want to hear from you which site could go to the could go into the housing element. If you feel certain sites are more important than others, we want to hear from you. So if you want to select a particular comment on a site, let's say this this site here, it's at 251 San Pedro site. We have a potential about 186 units. If you feel that's too much or too little, you can click on the send comment site. The key thing is you want to add your site code. So that's site code 9. And then you can write your comment here, and you could submit your comment. You want to make sure you add your name and email, and the comment on that site will be sent to the county. Not only can you look at the sites, as I mentioned, there's a lot of information that's available. If you click on the community profile tab, you can see to the left here, there's job proximity information, population density. There's all kinds of information about a site, and you can learn more about that site. If you click on the question mark, you can turn different layers on and off and zoom in and out. Same thing for community infrastructure. You can see where schools are located, major infrastructure lines. We have hazard information that's available. There's sea level rise data, flooding hazards. You can turn various data on and off. And you can provide comments to specific sites. And then there is one more tab on natural resources. So again, there's various tools available for you to comment on the various sites within your community or elsewhere in the county. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Joan.
Okay, so now we'd like to use the remaining time for your questions or comments. So I'll ask you to use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and I'll call on people just in the order that they come up on my list of participants of Zoom. And we have a lot of people on the line. There's a lot of hands going up. So let's be concise. There was a question that came in about balancing act that had to do with the scenario of countywide distribution. And so what was that based on? How did you do the allocation for that?
Yeah, so the way the allocation, how we did that was really trying to distribute the number of not only the higher density housing, but the different housing throughout the county, and particularly the environmental corridors. There's the city center environmental corridor, there's the rural inland corridor, and what is it, the Bay Area. We try to distribute the number of units, higher density housing units and lower density housing units throughout those. And we also try to distribute them equally throughout the different supervisor districts as well.
Okay, thank you, Jose. So now I'm going to start on the raised hands that are in the queue. Jillian will continue to answer the questions that she's able to in the chat. So our first person is Gina Hagan. So if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to start out letting you know a little bit about myself. My name is Gina Hagan, and I'm currently the president of the Santa Venetia Neighborhood Association. But I recently had brain surgery and I'm undergoing treatment for a brain tumor. And so I'm having a little harder time expressing myself quickly. So please bear with me. I'll try to be as concise as possible. I've been taking a hiatus from involvement in some things while I take care of my health, but this is a significant concern for many people in the neighborhood. So I wanted to be able to just share a couple of comments and concerns verbally, because I'm not able to utilize the online tool personally at this point. So Thank you. So we have one of the, there are a variety of concerns in the neighborhood. Some of them were mentioned, addressed, such as flooding and emergency related things. We have a lot of the homes in Santa Venetia are low lying, or and some of the sites that are located are in the low lying areas that are prone to flooding, or have vernal streams and ponds or marshes. And a large safety concern that many people have had, increasingly so over the last few years, is ingress and egress into our community. We have North San Pedro Road from the west, and on the east side, the road that goes through China Camp. Those are the only ways that we can get in and out of the neighborhood, because we're surrounded on the other side by San Pedro Ridge, which isn't passable by vehicle or accessible for people to walk over, some people, and then waterway on the north side. And sometimes the road through China Camp is flooded and not passable. So safety in doing any kind of larger scale number of units in the neighborhood is a concern specifically related to that. And we have community members who are more and more concerned. Also traffic is impacted because there's a lot of higher density stuff closer to the freeway, such as the Commerce at the Civic Center, the Market, Venetia Valley School, and the JCC, as well as other organizations and schools and just our residents. Sometimes the traffic is backed up from the freeway to past the stop sign by 7-Eleven, which is about a mile away from the freeway. So seeing numbers in this amount is concerning, just because we're already feel that the neighborhood is overburdened, and especially in case of an emergency. There are also some culturally sensitive areas. I know one specifically that's listed that has First Nation sacred sites, specifically Miwok shell mounds. So we do hope that with this process, these things are taken into consideration. And I grew up in Marin, and I recognize that housing is essential, but we have hope that we can use restraint based on the constraints that we have in our community for development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for taking the time to come to the meeting, and please take care of your health, Gina. We appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
So our next commenter is Roger Heller. Roger, please go ahead. You're still on mute.
Thank you guys very much for the presentation. It was very helpful. I live in the community. I have very significant concerns with at least the identification of the potential sites and the scope of the potential additional housing. I think Gina did a good job of mentioning the emergency ingress and egress issues. It's a real concern. And if you add 400 or even half of that additional units, that concern just gets worse and worse. More broadly, and I think Gina touched on this as well, we have a serious traffic issue in this neighborhood. There's only one way in and one way out of this neighborhood. And during high traffic times, which are, a lot of the times during the day, it really backs up. And to add, hundreds of people every day going in and out at pretty much at the same times, is just going to make things even worse, right? We're already overburdened as far as that goes. Two things that I wanted to mention that also relate to traffic are that, and I think you all should be aware that there are plans to expand the Venetia Valley School, which is on North San Pedro Road, which itself is going to further increase traffic problems if and when that happens. And there's also at least a goal at the JCC of expanding the school there significantly to add potentially hundreds of additional students coming in and out every day. So you've got hundreds of people at the JCC, hundreds of people, additional people at Venetia Valley School, adding to the already significant traffic issue, even before you talk about putting new units in. I also want to mention, as far as I understand it, the county has little, if perhaps no, control over expansion at the school. In other words, Santa Fe City Schools, if they want to expand their footprint, add classrooms, add additional enrollment, I think the county has very limited control over that. So I think that's something that ought to be taken into consideration. The last point I wanted to address is with respect to one of the sites in particular, which is 251 North San Pedro, which is the old Galena School. I think I saw before it's identified as having 7 acres or something like that. The vast majority of that space is currently a baseball field. And that is the only field the whole neighborhood has. And so, if, to put hundreds of, I think the sort of potential number of units for the site was like 186 units. And it's pretty clear from the map that that would include building basically on the baseball field. I mean, it's a school property, but it is first and foremost, I think, in terms of the space, baseball field.
Okay. And Roger, there's a few more hands, so I'll just ask you to wrap up, please.
Sure. The last point that I wanted to make, and I wanted to specifically refer you to page 63 of the Santa Venetia Community Plan, which specifically identifies preservation of ball fields and playing fields as something that's of particular importance to the community. The community came out multiple meetings and said, we want to preserve our fields, we want to preserve our recreational facilities. And if you're going to basically, put up a 100-unit, multiple unit housing to replace the baseball field, that runs headlong into that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Roger. Our next speaker or commenter is Judy. It's either Schriebman or Schreibman.
It's Schriebman. Thank you. I sent a couple of comments into the chat, which I hope we can get to, but I'm in the Los Ranchitos area, and I noticed that 2 of the scenarios, at least, I didn't look at all 4. They don't allow us to say plus or minus. They just say whether we would like duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes. This doesn't make any sense to me, and I'm wondering if we're the only area that's singled out this way, or if other areas are also singled out. This does run counter to our zoning. That was my question about zoning. We do have a specific kind of zoning in our area. So are we going to be just ignoring that with this plan? That's one question. The other thing is the cumulative impacts that we're going to be seeing in our area due to the great abundance of housing that's going into the mall, which is San Rafael's RENA numbers, and into the Northgate Walk and the other things. So is that going to be addressed in a cumulative fashion with the county and with this plan? Because we're seeing housing going in everywhere, not just our area. And this does need to be addressed. Traffic is a problem. Traffic will be getting worse. You hopefully know that we have only one north-south road, which is Highway 101. In an emergency, that road, when it flooded really badly, this was 2 years ago, it blocked up traffic in all directions for over 4 hours. Nobody got anywhere. No one got anywhere. The road was plugged. Adding more housing into this area without addressing traffic is asking for additional problems and putting people's health and safety at risk. I understand you feel like you're under the gun of the state, but I think you also have an obligation to support the health and safety of the current residents that are here. My only other comment is that I don't see a lot of affordable housing. And by affordable, I mean truly affordable to low income, the homeless, the extra low income. Affordable housing, as it's defined in Marin, usually means you've got a job or 2 or 3 and you can afford it. So any market rate housing, I think, is not what we need. I think we need really truly low income affordable housing, and I would like to see that emphasized. Thank you. I know that was like 3 questions and a comment.
Okay, thank you, Judy. Jillian, do you want to speak to the zoning question? You may have answered that in the chat, but others may be interested in it.
Yeah, I actually think it would be great for maybe Jose to start just explaining why Los Ranchitos as a neighborhood was considered in the strategy, and then I'm happy to add on about the zoning.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
let me briefly go over the zoning part. We're not ignoring the zoning. So what we've done is we've through our analysis, we've identified, we looked at the existing zoning and calculated through the analysis I talked about earlier. We counted units using the existing zoning numbers. And what we find is HCD requires for the affordable housing income, the very low and low income needs that higher density, and the existing density in the counties within certain sites don't meet that density range. So we have to, in certain areas, we do have to increase the densities for zoning. So we do, in some areas, we do have to change the zoning, and those areas are probably going to be some of the commercial centers, the areas that are in the where we're calling the city centers, or the areas along the 101. We do have to adjust some of the zoning, but for the most part, a lot of the existing sites, or the sites we've identified, we're using the existing zoning. The Los Ranchitos area, that's an area that we've looked at and saw that there is potentially opportunity to increase, maybe potentially a little bit of the density. We don't see it increasing it significantly, but allowing for duplexes or triplexes. But again, this is a site, if the community feels like, or through public comments, that this shouldn't be in the housing element, those are comments we want to hear from. Again, just because we've identified all these sites, not all of them are going to go into the housing element. We're going to get public input and see what sites through public engagement, what sites that we're hearing from the community that say, you know, this is a good site because it doesn't have these issues. I also want to bring up the cumulative effect of other of sites and traffic. As part of this process, we are going to prepare an environmental impact report that looks at all of the different sites. Even though we're not taking all of the sites over, the EIR, the environmental impact report, will look at all the sites, and traffic obviously will be one part of it. There is a section in the EIR that looks at cumulative projects, not only just housing, but you know, if there's another proposed project that has an application in the county for adjusting a school, or an adjacent jurisdiction in San Rafael or another community that has a project moving forward, the EIR does look at all those together, and then we'll provide mitigation and identify what those impacts are, what mitigation could be added to minimize those impacts. So an EIR will be prepared as part of this project. Jillian, was there anything else that I may have missed?
No, that was very complete.
Okay, so we have a little under 15 minutes left, and we have 6 hands up. So I'll ask people to be concise, and if we answer any questions, we'll try and be concise as well. So our next commenter is Helmut Winkelhock. If you want to please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my hand, and thank you for the presentation. My biggest concern is there any money set aside for increasing water storage? We just escaped the biggest drought, and we haven't had any rain since January, I think 6th or 7th. So we just got super lucky that we had a super rain event on October 24th. Otherwise, nobody would flush toilets and take a shower in Marin County. So yes, of course, everybody wants more housing, but how do you provide water to those new homes? Where is that Marin County jurisdiction that will provide the water? So unless you can provide reliable water sources to a new home, I think you set yourself up to a class action lawsuit. I mean, how can you build new homes and keep giving water meters out and have not the water available for long term, like 6-7 years in a row? You know, we entering a climate change where the drought periods are prolonged. Our weather system has changed. And so we're looking at 6, 7, 9 months of no rain. And of course, I think that needs to be really addressed unless Sacramento or somebody, all the units will be taxed with money to increase water storage. I think it's very irresponsible to provide new buildings to people that will not at some point have any water.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Helmut. Our next commenter is Layla Hill. Layla, you're still on mute. You should be able to unmute.
Yes,
There you
I'm
go.
also in Los Ranchitos. So rather than take up time, I'm going to second everything that Judy said. I have one really important point that I'd like an answer to, and that is Los Ranchitos is not a site. It's a neighborhood. No parcels are identified. No specific parcels are identified in this. And where you would put 80 or 139 units or build duplexes or triplexes, all the property is privately owned. And we, as far as I know, we have very few, if any, vacant lots. And if they are, they're unbuildable because they're too steep. We're in the fire zone. So after the number of units for an area like Los Ranchitos are identified, what happens then? I mean, is everyone's property going to be rezoned?
How about if I have Jose respond to how the numbers were identified for your neck of the woods?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but yeah, I want to make sure I answer that question. Yes, we've identified in the sites or the mapping, the Los Ranchos neighborhood. But as part of the analysis, when we do for sites that go into the housing element, we do have to identify specific sites. So we've identified specific sites. However, what's going to happen is the zoning, let's say if Los Ranchitos does go into the housing element, I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't, but let's say it does get selected, there will be a zone change to allow additional units in the Los Ranchitos area. The state does require that properties are identified in the housing inventory. Now, how we selected what sites we include in the housing inventory is based on the analysis we did. We selected houses that had larger properties, half acre or larger. We selected sites that had low building to land value.
Everyone in Los Ranchitos has an acre or larger. So that's not helpful.
Well, some, if you let me finish, some sites have improvements that have been added, so we've taken those out. Some sites have not, or some housing has not had a lot of improvements to it based off the assessed value. Those are evidence or criteria that we can put in the analysis in the housing element to show that, yes, we can add 100 or so additional units through duplexes or triplexes. So we will take those individual properties and put them in the housing element. But right now, we've just shown it as a neighborhood. We want to hear from the community to see, is this a neighborhood where we should we consider, if it gets selected, to increase the density and add additional units. So we're looking for comments on it.
Yeah, but
I'm going to add to Jose's comment.
Properties.
So wait,
Can I add to
Layla,
Jose's
Jillian's going to add to Jose's comments, and then I want to make sure there's a few more people still in line. So Layla, hopefully you'll get an answer and we can yield to hear from the other folks as well.
Okay.
So I do want to remind everyone that if a site is chosen for the housing element, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's being developed on. The county does not develop these sites, developers do. Another thing I want to mention is that we have a candidate housing site list on our website. I included a link here. And as Jose said, we have a lot more sites than we need for our arena. So if Los Ranchitos, sites in Los Ranchitos are not suitable, we want to hear from you. Whether that's sending an email or giving us a call or including suggestions on the map. We would really appreciate it. That's why we opened up such a
Right.
large list to the public, so that we can hear comments like this and understand what are the constraints.
And where specifically would we see that list? Is that that housing inventory list? Because that
Yes,
does
and I
not
can
list-
put it in the chat again.
Okay, it doesn't list individual properties though, the housing inventory list. It just says Los Ranchitos, 80 units or 139 units. And I would imagine this is the same for all the other neighborhoods.
Mm-mm.
No, just for the Los Ranchitos, because there was 139 sites that were identified in the Los Ranchitos area. But again, as Jillian
We
mentioned,
only have 144 properties. It's all
I
right.
know that-
Yeah.
Who can
so-
I speak to off of this out of hours to deal with this? Is this something to take?
You can
up?
speak to
Yeah.
me. You can speak to me. I also included our email in the chat. I'll do so again. It's housingelement@marincounty.org.
Right. Okay.
Thank
So, and we appreciate your patience and again, you are calling out your concerns. These are the concerns we want to hear. So in the queue, I have Giselle, Joyce, Bob, and then I got a message from Linda that she wasn't able to raise her hand. So we still have a few more folks, and then Ethan. So that'll be the queue, and we'll try and go through them quickly. We're supposed to wrap up at 7, but we'll stay a few minutes just because you're all here and we appreciate your interest. So Giselle?
Hi, this is Greg Block, Giselle's husband. We're here together. I have several quick questions, mostly about balancing act. First of all, I'm wondering if you've input the maximum number of available spots within balancing act. Has that fully been used, or are there still is there still space available in balancing act?
So balancing act starts with those the RENA number, that 3,569, because we want to give you the choice. If you are all in for one of the scenarios, you can just click on it and submit. However, you can move that number however you'd like, so you can start over and assign numbers based on what you think in terms of housing units. So
okay, but it sounded as though there was a limit within the program itself, and I was just wondering, did you use the limit that was available, not the RENA number, but the actual balancing act limit? The way I understood it was there was a total limit available within balancing act, so that was used. That's in place.
yes, we use the maximum. We put in the maximum number of sites that we could.
Okay. Secondly, can we, if there are sites that we think may be worth considering that were not recognized by through the process, can that be added?
Yes.
Is there a way to do
Yes.
that?
We are
Okay.
still taking site considerations. You can either email that housingelement@marincounty.org. We also have a website that I'll put in the chat. It's the housing site suggestions map. We've already heard from several people.
Great.
I'll put that in the chat.
And two other quick questions. When we use balancing act, do we have to, can we be site specific, or do we need to make adjustments so that our input is then balanced? I didn't quite understand that. If we take away, if I remember the example, if we take away here and say, gee, it shouldn't be 100, it should be 90, then do we need to find a spot for 10 more?
Yes.
And how can that be, though? Because we may have some insight or understanding based upon where we live and what we know of an area, but we may not know another area. So it seems really difficult for us to make. We might be able to make a comment that a site may be able to take more or less, but we wouldn't know the other sites maybe where it could be offset. So I'm just wondering if that's the only way to use balancing act, or if there's a way to have specific input without the balancing side of it.
Yeah, so actually to your question about, I don't know about other neighborhoods. I understand that's a legitimate concern, and that's why we created the atlas that Jose showed to allow you to turn on layers such as hazards in other neighborhoods, community profile, where's the school, where's the grocery store, so that you can conjecture where would housing make sense in another neighborhood. If balancing act isn't suiting your purposes in terms of you want to make comments on specific sites or you want to make suggestions, that link that I just put in the chat, it's the site suggestion map, and you can also put comments about specific sites in there if they're not on balancing act. The atlas also allows you to make comments on all of the sites.
That's great. That's wonderful. Thank you. And one last quick question.
Okay, great. You're
was
at your limit.
How was the community plan that the community invested thousands of hours into over the last decade or so? How was the community plan used in consideration for site selection?
So the community plan was used in consideration for site selection. However, we have recognized that the community plan for Santa Venetia and community plans for other areas of unincorporated county may not adhere to new state law around the housing element. So we will need to evaluate that based on new state law.
Okay, great. So
That's
thanks for all your
disappointing, but
questions.
thank you.
Okay, so next we are going to go to Joyce, and
Okay,
then it's
hi.
Bob, Linda, and Ethan.
Hi, I have 3 different points I'd like to make. One of them is about the interweaving in this area of county property and incorporated property. It's virtually impossible for most people to know which is county property and which is incorporated property of San Rafael. And so it's very, I think, specious or naive, or both, to consider what the density of housing, the density of school, educational facilities, and virtually everything will be without taking the entire area of the unincorporated part of the county that is San Rafael, and the incorporated and unincorporated, and putting those two together when you're looking at the impact of the type of assessments that you're making right now. Because, for instance, I saw one chat comment, well, could we do something in the parking lot of the Civic Center or with the court up there? And whoever it was wrote back, no, that's not in the unincorporated area. Well, I mean, that's the way it is. The airport is in the city of San Rafael, but and all the industrial property or commercial property over there, but it's all within the community that's unincorporated. So it's very important to take a look at those two areas together. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about demographics. I'm wondering if, in looking at making the assessments you've made, if there is an accounting for the fact that there are so many seniors living in Marin County who are selling their homes, and that is part of the inventory, and then moving to senior facilities, which are built as apartment buildings. There's a brand new one right now on 101 that appears to be in our area. I don't know whether it's in the county or in the unincorporated area, but that will probably provide housing for 200 to 300 people. Now that number should be included in here as part of the accomplishment of providing housing, because it's not taking away anything, it's adding. All the places where the seniors came from are now available properties, and they are now living in a condensed community. On the other hand, I think it's very important to look at when the new housing is provided, what is the aspect in terms of bringing in people, which we want, of course, people of young adults who are of childbearing age. and what that will mean in terms of needing land to build educational facilities as part of the future picture. So in terms of land use, all of those things have to be considered. The last point is a good portion of the unincorporated area is in a WUI situation, a wild area and urban combined, which are dangerous fire areas, giving on to roads that have no, there'll be no exit into China Camp. That, I mean, everybody understands that. The one exit out is to Highway 101 is North San Pedro Road. And building additional units along the road for that reason is also very problematic. So those are points I'd like to make.
Thank you, Joyce. Next we have Bob, and he's going to be followed by Linda and then Ethan. So Bob.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all this information and having this call, and I'm going overtime here. I'd like to second everything Joyce just said regarding unincorporated versus what's been incorporated. You just can't slice it that way. You got to look at it more holistically. So thank you, Joyce, for bringing that up, and your nursing home scenario and the wildfires. Regarding McPhail School site out near China Camp on the eastern part of North San Pedro Road, just very concerned that you're looking at 55 plus 4 plus 12 when we have wetlands area there. There's sea level rise, plus you have the environmental issues of land that's close proximity to the bay and to Galenas Creek. And to propose a high 55, would that be a high density apartment building out there in that corner of a residential area and an environmentally sensitive site subject to sea level rise? Just doesn't seem to make sense to me. So I wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
I do want to address one comment that Bob and Joyce had, just to clarify. And Jose may be able to comment on this as well, but when we're doing our environmental impact assessment, you know, when we take into account things like traffic, we're not drawing the line, okay, here's the county parcel, here's the city parcel. When we look at something like traffic, we have to look at the whole system. When we look at something like flooding, we have to look at the whole system. So although a site may be located in unincorporated, you know, Marin County versus incorporated San Rafael, we know that a lot of these sites are kind of islands in incorporated San Rafael, but we will take that into account.
Okay, thank you, because we feel our community has been burned several times by the city of San Rafael.
Okay, thanks for your comments, Bob. Linda, Levine or Levine, I believe you're up next.
Linda Levy, thank you. I've lived in Santa Venetia for over 30 years and served on the Neighborhood Association, Santa Venetia Neighborhood Association Board of Directors for almost 30 years. We try and get the word out and opportunities to comment. And we've heard from many of our residents, they want to protect their quality of life. We're already concerned about the constant fire danger, flooding, sea level rise, ingress and egress, and unsafe evacuation routes. Climate change is another huge concern for us. And as well, we've run out of water in Marin County. We're under strict mandates already, so I really can't understand how adding more and more housing units is going to be helpful. I also want to say 422 units in Santa Venetia is an increase of almost 25% of the 1,700 to 1,800 units we currently had at last count. It's a shocking number of additional units for us. I grew up in San Rafael and I look at it now and it's just, I know I shouldn't say it's not the San Rafael I grew up in, but there's no green spaces. They've built up to the sky. We really don't want that in Santa Venetia. And I don't know how it can be foisted on us like that. And I feel the same way about Los Ranchitos. I looked at that map and saw what you're going to do to Circle Road. It's just, I don't understand it. Affordable housing sounds great on paper, but we never get that promise fulfilled. I followed numerous projects in San Rafael. Every project has a promise of affordable housing. They pass, they give them the license to build, and there's no affordable housing. I don't know why. What's the promise that you're going to do this whole thing and we're going to have affordable housing? I don't know. I guess I just don't believe it anymore. Otherwise, I would say, okay, go for it, but it just never seems to happen. And finally, I heard you say you're going to have more flexibility by building on parking lots. If that's the case, where are people going to park? They've already lowered the parking needed for new buildings. I see whenever they build, oh, we've given them a density bonus, they're not going to have parking. We already have overblown congestion. We have parking along the road. We have tons of red curbs. The idea of reducing parking requirements for new units and building on parking required for old units is frightening. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm sorry to keep you so long.
Oh, and Linda, we appreciate your comment, and we appreciate everyone saying the extra time and being respectful of everyone who is speaking. Our next commenter is Ethan Stroll.
Hi, thanks for presenting and for staying long. I grew up in Los Ranchitos, and just like everyone else, I love where I'm from. And I also appreciate all the steps that are attempting to be done to like solve issues of affordability and equity in our community. As we all know, many of our neighborhoods remain inaccessible to lower income people, and I think that this process is at least a start towards solving that. Obviously, it's not perfect. People pointed out some of the issues with safety and affordability and whatnot. And I think there's lots of ways to have housing in our community and stay safe by designing public transit that meets that housing, and to have it not be in the wilderness urban interface like so many of our houses are. But the main point I just wanted to make was on like the public outreach done here. To my knowledge, I don't know everyone, but many of the commenters here are homeowners in our communities, because most of the homes in our communities are single home dwellings, and presumably are probably wealthier and older and mostly car users. And I just wonder how our county can reach the lower income community members who live and work here in Marin. I just wonder how their voices would differ from most of the thoughts would be spoken that have already been spoken. So just thanks for your work and look forward to moving forwards.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. You're our final commenter of the night. So I just want to very quickly take you through, let's see, here's where we are in the community roadshow. So concurrently, there was a meeting going on tonight in Marin City, and there's 2 more. So this is just one of several things the county has done to get out into the community, let people know about the process. And I think from Jillian's responses to your questions and also from Jose's answers, there's multiple venues, the balancing act tool, the different email address, being able to speak to county staff, so that we hear and get your advice, your local knowledge about the sites in your community. Let's see, one of Jillian's colleagues right now is staffing the virtual office hours. So if you're curious about Balancing Act and you're someone who would like a little bit more support when they try a digital tool, if you go to the county website, the address is on the footer of each slide. You can get a login to go straight to the office hours and someone will help you. We're not receiving comments on Balancing Act or the sites there. It's really just about a tutorial to use the tools. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jillian Ziegler for some final remarks from the county.
Thank you all for your participation. We appreciate your commitment to being involved in your community. We're hearing all of your comments. I hope this workshop was useful and provided you a good overview of the housing sites and how they were chosen, and your input is valued and important. And there are more opportunities to be involved, and I encourage you to use our web platforms and to send us emails and give us a call. And we look forward to hearing more from you. So thank you and good night.
Okay, thank you. We're officially adjourned. Good night.